So I just recorded this whole video and then realized that I didn't turn the camera on. So today I'm going to be talking about my least favorite books of 2020. This video is kind of going to be inherently negative just because that's the nature of this kind of video, but I feel like there is some merit in being able to discuss the things that people do and don't like about books. Just as I do want to talk about the kind of books that I do like and the kind of books that I do want to uplift and promote, I also want to talk about the kind of books that I don't like, not necessarily because I don't want them to be promoted, but because I think that there is power in understanding why you don't like the things that you don't like. I think that there are reasons to examine that. In this video, I have 10 books that I'm going to be talking about. I gave them all either 2 stars or 1 star. I don't mean anything cruel in making this video. I don't mean any harm, of course, to the authors for writing these books. They just, in a lot of cases, I could see the book working for someone else. It just didn't work for me. The first book that I'm going to talk about is Meet Cute Club by Jack Harbin. This book had all of the qualities that I wanted when I was trying to get out of a reading slump. The cover was really cute. The premise sounded really cute. It's about this guy who really likes romance novels and this guy who works at a bookstore doesn't really get that, and their shenanigans and adventures and how they get together. I just really didn't like the tone of this story. I just really didn't like the writing. It didn't really do it for me. And a lot of the situations that the characters ended up in were things that could have been easily solved if they communicated. I don't love a miscommunication trope, and a lot of the story just seemed designed to have the characters move into these situations rather than it seeming to happen organically. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Femme by Seth King. This is a relatively popular indie author who has a couple of books that are on my TBR list, so I figured I would give one of his books a shot. So I decided to read Femme, which is about this guy who feels like he gets kind of ostracized because he's a kind of feminine gay man, and he feels like looked down upon for that. And it was a really interesting exploration into that aspect of masculinity, especially with regards to LGBT men, because I feel like that's a point of view that we don't really get a lot in fiction. And it was really interesting in that regard. Unfortunately, it just kind of read like it needed to be edited down a little more, and the characters didn't really talk like characters. I mentioned in my last video about my favorite books of the year that I really like when there's good dialogue and stories. Just the opposite happens in books that I don't really enjoy. Oftentimes it is because there is dialogue that I just find unbelievable, and it's just something that is really hard for me to get over once I notice it in a book, and this book unfortunately did have that. The next book that I am going to talk about, I'm only going to talk about briefly because it is kind of a weird book. I don't really like rating nonfiction low, but this was a book called Two Teenagers in 20. It is a book of essays about the lives of LGBT youth from the 80s or 90s. It's a relatively older book, and I understand that these aren't professional writers, but I feel like there could have been a little more done in the editing room to make these stories a little more palatable. I just really feel like the stories that these people were telling were important, and if that they have been treated better in the editing process, then I feel like we could have gotten some really heart-wrenching moments of emotion, and that's not really what I got at the end of this book. I just got a lot of really juvenile writing that didn't really get any editing and didn't seem like it had a lot of care placed on it. The next book that I'm going to talk about is 10 Things I Can See From Here by Carrie Mack. This is a book that I picked up because it is set in Canada, and I was trying to fill a challenge on a bingo sheet. And it's set in Canada. I sure can say that. It sure is set in Canada. That's a little mean, actually. There was some pretty good OCD rep in this book. The main character has OCD, and it's very well addressed in the book, and I feel like there was a lot of either research or personal experience put into that character, but I hated her family so much. I hated her father so much, and it was just, I just didn't want to keep reading the book because I didn't want to keep reading about this person's family. I was like, does this book end with her getting away from these people? Because that's the only way I'm gonna like this book. And I mean, no spoilers, but I did give it 2 stars. I do have this thing with media a lot, and it happens in TV shows and movies too, where when there's a character that I dislike to a certain point, that media becomes unconsumable to me. It happened in this book. I really hated the father, and I didn't want to read any more about this father. And it happened in Shameless is a good example. I stopped watching Shameless because I didn't want to watch Frank anymore. And I mean, kudos to the actor because clearly he's doing a really good job at playing that character. But it has gotten to a point where I would rather just not watch the show than watch the show in order to get the bits of things that I do like at the expense of having to deal with this one character that I hate so much. The next book that I'm going to be talking about is Going Off Script by Jen Wilde. I hate this book, and every time I try to think of what I want to say about it, all I can think about is how much I hated it. And I didn't give it 1 star, I gave it 2 stars. But every time I think about this book, I just think about how horrible this book was. And there's another Jen Wilde book on my TBR. And do I even want to read that? Do I even want to give it a shot? I hated this book so much. And I just don't know what else there is to say about it. It was bad. It was badly written. I liked one character, and I kept screaming in my head for her to get away from the main character because she was just awful. I hated this book. I hated this book. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Maps by Nash Summers. This is another indie published book, and you can tell there were more mistakes than I'm used to seeing in traditionally published fiction, and maybe it's an unfair standard to be held to, but I just noticed that a lot. I proofread for a living, so I notice mistakes and spelling errors and grammatical errors, and if there's too many of them, it just gets to a point where it's like, well, then what did you do? What editing did this book go through? And that's just the technical aspects of this book. That doesn't even go into the humor of this book, which is very like, ooh, I'm kooky, I'm random, I'm going to say things, and they're going to be funny because they're so random. And it's not. It's not funny. That kind of humor isn't funny. It's only funny if you're like 12 and in 6th grade. The next book that I'm going to be talking about is #First Impressions, #Second Chances. You'll see that I glanced down there to look at my notes to make sure that that is what the book is called because it is stylized like that. The cover is formatted to look like a Tumblr post, if that tells you anything about the book itself. And I think nothing more really needs to be said. It's kind of a book about social media and about this blogger, like a fashion blogger in college, and it's not good. It's really short. It's about 45 pages, and it still took me like 4 days to read. I didn't like it. I just felt like it was like a caricature of what influencers are and what blogging culture is and of what feminine gay men are like, frankly. It felt very stereotypical, and I know that the author is not male. Her name is Heidi something. I don't remember her last name. I'll look it up later. The last 2-star book on my list is Kamikaze Boys by Jay and Andreas Bell. There are a couple of other Jay Bell books on my TBR, frankly, because their covers are very pretty, and I'm shallow, and I'm a sucker for a pretty cover. They're very colorful and pretty and rainbow, and they have a set, like a book set, that each book is a different color, and I really want it. But I gave this book 2 stars, and it's the only Jay Bell book I've ever read. I own 2 other ones, but like, do I want to read them? I gave this 2 stars. it made me very uncomfortable in certain places. The relationship is between, I believe, an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old. And just in certain places, that power dynamic was really gross for me. And there were other things that happened in the book. Just every layer that this book added made me believe it less and less. And this isn't like a sci-fi book. This isn't a fantasy book. It's a contemporary book set in the modern day. And the people act in ways that no human has ever acted on the history of this earth for any reason. And then they would have to try to find a solution to the problems that they just caused by acting in this nonsensical way. And the solution is yet another incredibly nonsensical thing that they have to do that will somehow solve the problem. And it doesn't make any sense. And then the book ends. And you finish reading and you're like, am I real? Did this take place? Am I taking place on Earth? And I didn't really enjoy that question of my metaphysical being. So I gave this book 2 stars. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Love We Lost by Una Celeste. The only thing I can say about this book that is good is that it has lesbians in it. It doesn't have good writing. It doesn't have good characters. It doesn't have good dialogue. It's got lesbians. It just read very juvenile-y, and I don't believe it was meant to. And now we've finally gotten to my least favorite book of the year. It was horrible, terrible, and really bad. Congratulations to 28 Gays Later by Max Barber. Now, maybe I should have known going into this what I was going to get. This book is called 28 Gays Later. But I thought, maybe. And I shouldn't have. Because I read this book. I read this whole book. All of it. And I finished it and I thought to myself, I could have been doing so many other things with my time. I could have been reading a better book. I could have been taking a nap. But I wasn't. I was reading this book. I was reading 28 Gays Later. I literally have on my notes here, it says, shitty, gross, my favorite character died. That's all I have to say about that. Okay, so we have come to the end of the video. That was the 10 books that I hated this year. That's unfair. I didn't hate all of them. Some of them I just disliked a lot. I don't know what video I'm going to film next. This was the sum total of all of the ideas that I had, so I'm going to have to grow some new ones organically. No idea. You'll know when I know. Bye.